Hello! Today we will be discussing the third phase of the design thinking process, ideation. We will start with the checklist as there are certain things that should be in place when you begin this process. So, phase one, as you prepare for phase one, um, and we'll talk about this again a little later, pre brainstorming activities. Sandra, what are some of those pre brainstorming activities that they might use?
So this is really just to get your brain warmed up to begin collaborating as a group and kind of spur on that divergent thinking. For example, perhaps you are brainstorming all of the uses for a bottle cap. What are all these things that we could do to a bottle cap? Or you have a circle amongst you in the creativity video by the CEO of IDEO. He has a paper with 30 circles. And he says, within 1 minute, what are all the different designs that you can do in 30 circles? And what are things that you can turn them into? So, this is just a fun way to get your brain warmed up.
And what about the 100 ideas?
The 100 idea challenge is really for your design thinking topic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be, ideation, and we call it slash the 100 idea challenge because there are no constraints to your brainstorming. Much like Steve Jobs says, the crazy, the outlandish ideas are the ones that are innovative and can really come into a beautiful product. So that is kind of our main theme for today, Ideation, the 100 Idea Challenge. And then today you are going to be doing two sets of brainstorming. So the first one is the 100 Idea Challenge, and then the second one is later on into part two where you're refining your ideas. So, what are some constraints you might see within some of the ideas you created? And you're going to brainstorm solutions to these constraints. What are some solutions to funding, to naysayers, to supporting all subgroups, and so forth?
Okay, all right. So, back to part one again. When you begin your brainstorming, you want to make sure that you have a succinct, well defined topic to get started. And by now, in phase three, we should have a succinct, well defined topic. Um, and then we need to have a good space for the brainstorming process. If you're doing this virtually, then you have to think about a virtual space again that you can use where all of you are participating in the brainstorming process. And this is a group effort, not a one single person effort. And then you have to look at protocols to ensure every voice is equally heard. And I believe we have some protocols that you will find in your week week three as well.
Um, so, in virtual brainstorming, there are a couple of suggested sites. Um, One idea is to have one person on that suggested site and then perhaps use Google Hangout or um, Skype or whatever virtual platform you guys are doing, and then add on to that virtual kind of sticky note. If you guys are doing it together, sticky notes, poster paper, and markers are highly suggested so that you're able to write all of your ideas together and then move them around and later cluster the similarities.
And do we have some videos that show them groups actually working on that?
Definitely. There was another school whose design thinking challenge was to create a space that was more student centered, and we have some example videos for you posted, I think, on Meet the Week 3 module a little bit later down the page.
Okay, all right. So the other components of part one, we kind of discussed those in terms of um, the I lost my thought here. So we kind of discussed some of the visuals, and then the brainstorming sessions were just discussed. So we'll go into part two. I think Sandra, you discussed most of that, right?
Mm-hmm. So once you have all of the ideas brainstormed, you are going to begin clustering. So, clustering and categorizing ideas based on their similarities, and then kind of seeing what themes are emerging throughout those clusters. Um, Within your group, silently first kind of select which are the most inspiring ideas, rational ideas, which are some of the most darling ideas, or the ones that are kind of innovative, and the ones that are the most long shot. And finally, but most importantly, what are some of the ones that are most likely to delight the end user? And that's where our empathy piece is really coming in again. And the reason that we're doing this silently first is so that we're not influenced by anyone else's preferences or paradigms, and then sharing out afterwards.
Okay, good. All right, and then into part three, once we have done our due diligence and truly engaged in brainstorming as many different ideas as we possibly can, then we have to start to do some converging here and look at what is actually feasible and not feasible. So here we ask ourselves a number of questions. Who would be opposed to these ideas? And these are some of the constraints. And we're not just asking the questions to identify the constraints, but also to identify solutions to the constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So, who would be opposed? What's the cost? Uh, where will we get the funding? What are the time constraints? And then, as you ask, these are examples, of course, of questions around constraints. But then you're also looking for ways to address the constraints. And that's where more brainstorming comes in. And then the evidence of having done a second round of ideation based on these new findings around your constraints. Okay, so then we'll do that. We will provide further evidence of evaluating our ideas, vetting our ideas, and then final ideas described in succinct single in a succinct single sentence or single sentences. All right, and here you might also need a few experts to check in with them um, for the next few phases coming up. So we haven't let go of our experts yet. As we finish up ideation, we're thinking, well, we need some more experts as we move into the next phases. So we might want to start thinking about that. All right, so that's the checklist.
So let's go forth and talk a little bit more about ideation itself. Ideation is truly seeing opportunities for change or novelties. Could be brainstorming to encourage you to think more expansively without any constraints. It is often the wild ideas that begin visionary thoughts in products. And ideation means generating lots of ideas. And actually, the IDEO company suggests that you go for quantity, because a lot of times um, we are already judging the quality of things. But when you go for quantity, you are able to remove any prejudices you might have right then, and just go positively forth in that moment.
Okay, so ideation, we looked at the checklist, and there are actually three components: generating lots of ideas, and we talked about that with the brainstorming. And then once we generate as many ideas as we can, then we come down to refining the ideas, and we discussed that in the part three of the checklist. And finally, at the end of part three, we have to describe your idea, the idea that you are now going to take to the next phase, which is experimentation. Right? So these are the three areas of ideation.
Okay, so going a little bit more in depth within the first part again, prepare for brainstorming, facilitate brainstorming, select promising ideas, and building to think. So make sure that your surroundings are preparing yourself and setting yourself up for success. Make sure you have all of your materials. Make sure that you start with a warm up to get your positivity flowing, and to also ensure that you have the same rules and norms together and reinforcing those rules.
Okay. And so you can go back to the checklist again because the checklist should help you with these areas. But before we start to brainstorm, we need to have some guidelines that help us to make the most of our brainstorming sessions. When we talked about critical thinking, one of the things that we need to do is defer judgment, to have an open mind. And that's extremely critical for brainstorming. And so there are no bad ideas. So we encourage all ideas, we defer judgment, we build on the ideas of others, and when ideas are wild, we encourage those because maybe we can't do that wild idea, but maybe from that wild idea, we generate other ideas which are viable. And so we want to look at all the possibilities that exist. And as we do our brainstorming, we want to go for quantity. So we talked about the 100 idea challenge. We want to push for 100 different ideas. And then from those ideas, we can pare it down. We want to be visual. And so here we're going to use either, if we're in a face to face setting, then we're going to use our post its to generate our ideas. And we're going to share out those ideas one by one with our group members. If we're doing this virtually, then Sandra has uh, some resources for you in your week 3 that you can use. So be visual, stay focused, and one conversation at a time.
Okay, so once you've completed your 100 idea challenge, you're going to begin refining your main idea. Do a reality check. Make sure that it is not just creativity and novelty for novelty's sake. Go back and look at your challenge. Is this really going to meet the needs of my end user? Is this really adhering to our overall challenge? And then you're going to begin clustering your ideas. So, making sure that you see the similarities and kind of the headliners, as I like to call them. What are some of the themes that continue to reemerge,
Mm-hmm.
and begin describing your idea?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you want to really identify those emerging themes, and then this is where we converge again, going from the divergent to our convergent um, thoughts and ideas. Okay, so key ideas from brainstorming, those radical solutions were, selected solutions were, and we selected these because. So as you end this phase, we want to identify each of these components, and that will help us actually in coming up with our um, uh, describing your idea. So actually, before you describe your final idea, you want to look back to your radical solutions, selected solutions, and why you selected those. And that should help you in coming up with your final ideas. The other thing that we hadn't mentioned that we should is that when you do your brainstorming, you want to start with each individual doing a few brainstorms or jotting down some ideas and then sharing those out one by one. And then collectively, you can continue with the brainstorming process. But we want everyone to engage in this process at first individually so that, again, we can hear every voice. And then collectively, we continue the brainstorming process or processes.
And you'll see an example of how teachers were able to do so in a live video as an exemplar on the same module page.
Okay, I think that's it. Created using Powtoon.